alum. Have also been involved in the clean and climate tech space for quite some time. Super excited today to be talking with some friends and folks who I consider to be family about investing in the climate and clean tech space. So the conversation today is going to be a lively one. Would encourage anyone who's joining to chime in with questions and comments via chat. Before we introduce our panelists, I just want to give a little bit of background for both Black VC as well as the topic today, clean and climate tech. So BIPOC representation in that space, both from an investor as well as from a founder. This is, for starters, one of a two-part series. So in the session today, we'll be focusing on the investor perspective with some really phenomenal investors in the space, well-known, incredibly proven track records. In this second session, which will likely be happening in about a month or so, we'll be focused on the founder side of this conversation and the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem. So similar cast of incredible folks who have been working on climate clean tech in the broader startup ecosystem for quite some time. Just quick comment on Black VC. Black VC is a nonprofit that's focused on increasing representation for Black investors in venture capital. The clear lack of representation in one of the most concentrated exchanges of wealth, power, and influence in the world calls for someone to take some action on that. With about 3% of venture capitalists being Black and even fewer being in key decision-making roles, either owning or running funds, there's clearly a need for this kind of work. So Black VC's mission is to connect, engage, and empower, empower, and advance Black venture investors with a goal of doubling the number of Black investors by 2024. I am a product of one of their programs. If you're interested in learning more about their entry investor programs, both the Black Venture Institute and then Breaking Into Venture, I would encourage you to go to their website at blackvc.org. Just a quick 50,000 foot view on climate and energy. Climate and clean tech has been a topic of conversation for quite some time. Both advocates and activists have discussed the implications of climate change for the last at least 3 decades. I used a 3-decade milestone as an allusion to the ongoing discussions that have happened really at the United Nations level. But obviously they trickle down to both national and then local policy. The allusion to increasing risk in infrastructure, economy, and more broadly society, if we don't take action, has culminated more recently in a report that came from the United Nations IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, their 6th iteration, which calls for urgent action on climate and urgent action associated with energy. In the first section of that report, they call out explicitly the current state of climate change. So if you have any questions or reservations, this report's a great one to reference. The report states it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred as a result of human intervention. So if you had any questions about where we're at with climate, that's the flavor of the day. Bit challenging, a bit complicated, but hopefully we got some answers to some of the problems today. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to our panelists to allow them to introduce themselves. Just 3 quick questions for you. How did you get involved in energy and climate? How did you get involved in investing? And how did you land your current role? And we'd love to start with you, Taj.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Black VC, for having me here and putting on this event. I really appreciate it. So the first question is, how did I get started in climate investing or clean tech? It's really interesting because I was a traditional or regular SaaS software investor prior, founder myself, but I got sick and I started seeing that there's a correlation between public health or health and the climate issue. I think for the longest, people have talked about the climate issue as if this is this future-proofing, this long-term type of thing we need to be aware of and afraid of. My take on it is that it's here right now and we're suffering from it. But from an investment standpoint, I started out at the University of California, Riverside as the accelerator director. They're really kind of making advances in companies that are focusing on renewable energy and clean tech, and then over to Lacey. And then from an investor standpoint, I was working as a banker, started making some personal investments as an angel, and you really kind of got the bug from that standpoint on. And I'm sorry, what was your third question, Ryan?
Yeah, just what's your current role? How did you get into your current role? So I know
Yeah,
you've
so I'm currently the founder GP for Include Venture Partners. It's a new fund of funds that's dedicated to increasing the amount of folks who look like us and more in the clean energy space and as well. So thank you for this.
Excellent. Thank you for that background, Taj. We'd love to turn it over to you next, Nneka.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nneka. So I got involved into energy or climate kind of by accident. I was doing my master's at Tulane, focused on finance with the idea that I would be a quant and that I'd work for a hedge fund. But being in Louisiana around the time that a lot of the shale gas was popping off, I got really interested and decided to make energy my specialty and decided not to work for a fund and instead to join NextEra Energy Resources and did a bunch of finance roles through there. After business school, I joined PG&E and did some strategy work. But my last role at PG&E was really focused on how do you get the utility to work better with startups. And it was really interesting to see how a behemoth organization that's 150 years old had a hard time figuring out how to be nimble. From there, I kind of jumped into the accelerator world and was on the opposite side, helping startups work with these large organizations, institutions, industrial players to execute large scale projects. And then from there, now where I am at Aligned Climate Capital, we're investing in those same businesses on a larger scale across kind of the value stream. I landed my current role actually through some of the relationships that I've made in this space. I mean, they talk about venture capital being a relationship business. I started off working in corporate, but really through a founder that I worked with, I was on on their board, and he recommended me for this role, and it just turned out to be a perfect fit. So I always like to, pass it forward that when other people are looking for roles or interested in this space, that I look out for them and try to offer opportunities as well, because I know it's not easy.
Phenomenal. Thank you for that, Nneka. And just a small plug before I go to you, Christian. Both Nneka and Taj are a part of a phenomenal group of folks who are also having these conversations called Green Tech Noir. So maybe at some point in the conversation today, we can talk a little bit about Green Tech Noir.
Absolutely.
Before that, I'd love to turn it over, last but not least, Christian.
Hey, I'm also part of Green Tech Noir and a big fan of what Nneka's put together. I got into energy kind of by chance, but in a weird way almost. It seemed like it was designed because I grew up in an oil and gas family. My father was a petroleum engineer, grew up in Louisiana. Went to college, studied econ, was super interested in econ, didn't want to be an academic, wanted to go into business, started off in investment banking at Goldman, did one of those rotational programs, did a bunch of groups, and really kind of the only one that stuck was natural resources. And I think, kind of the ability to see the macro and to really think about some of those underlying and really kind of catalytic forces that really kind of underpin technology. When you think about humanity's ability to harness our natural resources, I thought that was just very kind of compelling for me. And then as you started to kind of think through that logic and think about how do we do that sustainably in order for humanity to continue to move forward. And so really got compelled by that after 3 years in banking. And then, kind of wanted to get closer to these businesses, went to business school, and then spent, 3 years with a startup platform that was private equity backed, building infrastructure projects in Africa. Learned a lot doing that work. It was very challenging. We weren't, terribly successful, but just really kind of understood some of the challenges in building infrastructure, new technology, in challenging markets. And, from there, got into investing. And first role was with a family office, and we But looking at, kind of similar things with new technologies, but largely the US, but really focused on building first of a kind projects. And really kind of loved that experience, and even spent, part of my time there working directly with companies that were, building sustainable data centers or building anaerobic digesters, and really kind of these first of a kind technologies into new markets, and really got to sharpen my skill as an investor, as well as someone who deeply thinks about project development. My current role is with Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. It's kind of combining those experiences. I'm a partner there, and we're really kind of focused on the innovation of infrastructure broadly. We were spun out of Alphabet a few years ago, and then also have Ontario Teachers as an investor, and really thinking about, whether it's digital infrastructure, virtual power plants, autonomous vehicles, and kind of the infrastructure that you need for that. Like, how can we really move the world forward to take advantage of these new technologies, and again, have that underlying infrastructure that's really going to be catalytic in our ability to commercialize these technologies. And so, I've been doing that for a few years, and really kind of excited. I've been doing that for a few months now, and really kind of excited to continue to build my career in that space. And happy to talk about infrastructure investing, venture investing, or project development.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Christian. Phenomenal background again from all panelists. And just before we get into the questions, just one quick shout out to a friend and family member of ours that wasn't able to make it today because of a conflict. Amy DeFore, principal at Prime Impact based in Boston, another part of this incredible community of investors that are tackling this topic and that look like us. So that's a good thing. So let's jump into I want to get into probably the most contentious conversation related to risk and return, and sort of how we conceptualize investing in this sector, which is something known as Clean Tech 1.0. This was an era roughly between 2006 and 2011, where there was a pretty substantial amount of investment, in particular from venture, but from other sources, into clean tech specifically, something of the order of magnitude of 25 billion. And a very interesting article that came out of MIT quoted that 25 billion, almost over half of that was not a 1X for clean tech. So there's a bit of a sentiment or a bit of a perception around clean tech investing from that Clean Tech 1.0 era. We'd love to turn it over to you all to talk a little bit about how you saw that period of time. Were there any technologies that you saw being a part of that? And what are some general thoughts and opinions that you have about this sort of challenging period of time for investing in clean and climate tech?
So I started my career towards the end of Clean Tech 1.0. It feels like it was really not that long ago, the way we're talking about it, like it was like World War II or something. And the reality is there were so many opportunities, but sometimes the wrong type of money going after those opportunities and not understanding the landscape. Every time I have a conversation like this, I always think about like, what is the origins of how venture capital investing came to be? And a lot of times it was for resource or asset light technologies and software. And all of a sudden, folks that didn't understand how all of these systems work and the complexity and the capital intensity of working with some of these renewables and kind of breakthrough technologies were putting a bet on something that was way riskier than they understood the risk profile for. Additionally, there are a lot of technologies that were propped up by subsidies or special programs that once those special programs or tax credits, et cetera, kind of folded away, the market hadn't jumped up, the products hadn't jumped up to meet market prices yet. So we had this gap in terms of like, what supply was versus what demand was. And on top of that, I think there was also this piece around like, what does it take for a community or a society to shift the way that they engage with their energy sources or engage with, any of these assets that are a brand new shift to technology. So if you're thinking about the US utility system, which generally has a age of about 100 to 150 years, that's running off like coal and hydropower. And within 10 years, we're trying to shift into, solar panels and wind and things like that. I think it was just like kind of a shock to the system. Obviously, there were mistakes, and I think there were some challenges with, countries like China being able to subsidize even further some of their technologies to compete on a global market. But I also don't want people to fall into the trap that we are in a second version of that, because the opportunity that we have is so much different from Clean Tech 1.0. I think Clean Tech 1.0 was really about testing technology and understanding if this renewable technology can fit into the world that we've built. But now we're in a spirit of climate chaos, and we don't have any choice but to fix our energy use, our consumption, our carbon use, and that we need to kind of lean into some of those riskier technologies that were already risky in Clean Tech 1.0 or wouldn't even be a thought during Clean Tech 1.0. And think about how do we structure investments that make sense, whether those are credit facilities or revenue share facilities or some or other sort of way for us to put money into technology that doesn't fit within that asset light software app focused investment strategy that venture capital has succeeded so well with.
I'd agree with all of those points. I definitely want to hear Taj's perspective because his career in this space has been longer, and I think Nneka and I both kind of joined at the end of Clean Tech 1.0. Yeah, and just to kind of probably lean in where Nneka finished off, I think that there's more sophistication in terms of the capital players that are in the space now. In particular, if you think about, if you're going to do something that's not asset light, that's more capital intensive, you really got to go through funding cycles, and you need enough investors that are willing to jump in at those different funding cycles. So you can't have the capital formation gaps that you had in Clean Tech 1.0. And I think in Clean Tech 2.0, there's been a lot more investors who can jump in at the early stage, who can jump in at late stage venture, jump in at project finance, kind of where Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners is trying to fill that gap, and then institutional investors who can then do kind of the really heavy lifting on the asset financing side. And you're seeing kind of that flow start to really evolve and start to move now. There definitely needs to be more investors. I think, every day you're seeing larger and larger funds that are being raised, which is exciting to see. And they are all going to have to decide, what gaps do they want to fill? Like, what is your risk profile? What makes most sense for you, for those investors? And, but it's exciting to kind of see more of that capital formation happening. And I think a lot of it's happening because LPs are demanding it, and also because consumers are also demanding it. The kind of world really wants is embracing that energy transition and moving forward. I think it was an exciting thing to think about in Clean Tech 1.0, but I think all of those pieces are really starting to come together. It's like we don't really have a choice but to move in this direction.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Nneka and Christian hit the nail on the head. When we talk about subsidies, we talk about the type of capital and capital coming in, and quite honestly, too, what's happening, which I'm loving it, is there's more capital coming, more investors are taking a chance, and tools such as rolling funds and everything else, My Climate Journey, all these other funds that are coming in and really kind of shaking up and taking risks like venture should, And so I think that's one of the things that's changed. The other thing I think has changed too is the type of founders. I think the founders of this era, in my opinion, they understand that you have to really have impact, environmental impact, but also financial impact as well. You want to make a return for your investors, and you want to ensure that you're truly building a product. And I think thirdly, one of the things that's really interesting is that the marketplace has changed. I think now, you ask anybody in Texas, in my beloved home state, about ERCOT, they know exactly what that is. And that's because it impacted them recently, right? And so I think now what's happening more so, you're having people and the market really understanding and realizing the impacts of climate change, the impact of their energy usage and everything else. And it's going broadly too. So it's not just the way we use energy, but it's our clothing that we see recyclable things on there. It's our food, So I think it's just a confluence of timing, market, investors, and everything else that make the transition between clean tech 1.0 and clean tech 3.0. And what's interesting, thank you for this question, Ryan, is that my partners and I, we do this blog for series, and we're going to be talking just about that, the transition between clean tech 1.0 and clean tech 3.0.
That's phenomenal. These are great responses. I had a script here, but we're going off script a little bit because I like the direction this is going. Let's jump forward to really talking about diversity of investors in the space. So Taj, Christian, and Nneka, you mentioned that it's really exploded in terms of who we're seeing, both on the specializing fund side and on the generalist side. Really exciting news from Energy Impact Partners with the Elevate Future Fund, Anthony Oni over there doing a great job, and a ton of others. What really is the differentiating factor for some of these newer investors? Is it generally better to have this long wind expertise in energy funds? I mean, how are they looking to get involved in this space?
I don't know if it was me, but it kind of chopped up, but I think I got the gist of your question, Ryan. I think, as an example, and I just typed it in the chat, in addition to the great work that Energy Impact Partners has done in partnering with Vita and Anthony, one of the things we've done is really kind of work with, a number of foundations. We want to see more funds that are owned by people of color, not just people of color working at funds, and specifically in the climate sector. So as an example, we have an initiative in partnership with Kibuule Foundation and others to really fund Black and Brown led funds that are focusing on climate, whether those are private funds or public funds. And that's just an example to many different things that are out there. Some other things I'm loving that I'm seeing is like On Deck Fellowship, which is minting a number of different investors in the space. Of course, the stuff that we're doing with Green Tech Noir, which Nneka founded. So I think now what's happening is that you're having a lot more resources that would allow the number of investors that are out there of color. And I think for me, the important piece of that is not just a moralistic thing of having more Black and Brown folks on your team, but rather what it's about is having people who have different types of worldviews and different types of areas that they look at. I'll give you a perfect example. When I always talk about this story about micromobility, micromobility is being part of clean tech, and the ubiquitous scooters that are in Southern California that are all on the West Side. When we had a company that just had a person of color on the team that said, what if they had a basket to this, and they just changed the whole use case of this product to where it's now truly a product for people to utilize who may live in food deserts or other types of things as well. So for me, that's what diversity brings. Diversity brings a new way of looking at product, a new way of really kind of implementing it and making a return as well.
And I'll answer the question from the broader perspective that there's so many funds coming into climate. A few years you saw companies like BlackRock and others make announcements about focusing on climate, but I think just yesterday, Macquarie announced a $6.9 billion infrastructure fund focused on climate. So we're seeing not just big players, institutional players, but also a lot more smaller players coming into the space. And I think it's good, just like, iron sharpens iron. I think there's already a super competitive space to lead rounds, but it also means that founders are going to benefit as well, on top of additional capital coming into the space that might have a negative impact in terms of some overblown valuations. But it also means that you're going to get some more opportunities to pick and choose who you want on your cap table, who are going to bring some expertise, whether that's on building new things, M&A, product management, et cetera, where it used to just be that when a company had a clean tech oriented business, they had only 3 or 4 people who they could go to for funding upfront. And now we're talking, I've been using the term climate tech, a lot of people are, that it's not just about clean energy, but climate tech is extending all the way to things like indoor agriculture and the circular economy And if you look at where we're seeing a lot more diversity in startups, we're seeing them across the board in, clean transportation, food business. I talked about circular economy, but like even more places than the traditional like solar and wind and storage and things like that. We're there too as well. But by pulling on all of these players into climate tech and giving an opportunity for a food entrepreneur to get funding at the scale that other sorts of entrepreneurs can get funding is also really powerful in terms of scaling impact.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add here. I think a lot of that's happening because, as clean tech evolves to climate tech, you're moving away from just doing utility scale projects, with the utility and old white guys that are behind those utilities, right? So now it's more about engaging with communities, actually building things, either at the distribution level, at the community level, and you really need investors and you need developers that look like the community. They can really know who to engage in those communities, and so I think you're seeing more of that, which is great. And increasingly, I'm seeing more founders that are people of color come across our desk, which is exciting, and really kind of taking ownership of the solutions that they're building that are engaging with their communities, which is all exciting.
Yeah, phenomenal. And just one, try to throw in some fast facts here in the middle. Just one piece of information that I found interesting in preparation for this conversation was that there's roughly 17 billion in 2020 that was allocated specifically for climate tech VC. So a lot of that is outside of the traditional energy investing. A lot of that is in circular economy. A lot of that is in sustainability and resilience broadly. So definitely seeing that echoed in some of the things that I'm reading. Would love to, just on that point, Christian, dig a bit deeper in terms of the community piece. So you spent a bit of time at Emerson Collective as an investor, and the thesis, as I understand it, is really around this community-centric or community-driven model of thinking about change. And I know this is a philosophy that all of you have around your theory of change. So we'd love to talk a little bit about the importance in particular in clean and climate tech for centering on community and thinking about the where investors are coming from and where founders are coming from.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm happy to. They can't talk too much about specific investments there, but we had a unique model where we were very focused on technologies that were enabling communities at a deep level. And Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners does as well. And I think at Emerson Collective, just given just really the deep interest and care that the Lorraine Jobs had in starting the organization, and it was really kind of tied in the ethos and the culture of the organization, largely because driven by some of the philanthropy work she's done for a long time. We were really tasked with going and finding out, best-in-class investments that were tied to that philosophy. So, for instance, we made investments. A resi solar developer, right? Which Sunrun, and there are a number of them that are, call it kind of the market standard. But we went out and found the best-in-class resi solar developer that was focused on low to moderate income communities. And it was, it's still turning out to be a great investment. They're doing really well. There was no trade-off in returns and still kind of very deeply impactful, but they found a model that worked for those communities because they were deeply embedded in those communities. We did something similar with waste to energy. And if you think about turning waste into energy, what you're going to find the most polluted communities, unfortunately, the most polluted communities are going to be typically the underprivileged communities. And so they were out there building their projects and, really kind of communities that were like the 99th percentile of pollution across the US. And so it was exciting to be able to work on those projects. And, we were even building sustainable data centers out in kind of Stockton, California, and working with former Mayor Tubbs out there, just given the connections or relationships that we had with him, and to really kind of be there and understand kind of, where those communities wanted to go, the technologies that they wanted to build, and how they wanted to be part of this energy transition. Was kind of exciting to see it, and great to be able to define specific projects and technologies that can really evolve that space.
It's
Yeah,
like,
I was gonna let you, or Nneka, go ahead. I want to get in.
so, sorry, just for clarity, just some of the investments excited to have made and what we're looking at really broadly. Going back to some of the more public investments I've made when I was at Elemental, I was really excited to invest in Fervo Energy, which is looking at geothermal and rethinking how we're developing old oil and gas centers for renewable energy and like really reclaiming land for a positive purpose. Some other investments I worked on are Illume Energy. It's a product that allows for people who live in multifamily buildings to have access to solar, which is huge because such a huge percentage of people in our urban centers aren't living in single family homes and have been like kind of cut out of the green, economy there. Another company that we invested in at my current firm is Sealed. So also thinking about what does it mean for someone who wants to have access to clean energy, whether that is retrofits or any other sorts of upgrades that you want to do to your home to actually get financing for it in a way that isn't too complicated and you can pay off slowly over time, as well as thinking about VPPs and how do we utilize behind the meter assets to really create some stability and some grid resiliency. But overall, things I'm looking at right now are really thinking about what does it mean for us to overhaul some of our old school systems, whether that's heavy duty trucking, the structure of supply and logistics, and convert some of these old school systems to be more climate friendly.
Yeah, I think for me, what I enjoyed, and I'm going to talk about back in the Lacey days because it just came from that, is that there's a reason that you want to have diversity on your investor mix because that really influences the types of companies and founders that we see. One company in particular I'm really proud of, and the story is one that we need to take heed to, is Charger Health, founded by Camille Terry Fullington. And I met Camille back when Techstars had an event in South Central LA at Nipsey Hussle's spot. And she was still just working for a company. But with the encouragement of the community, in less than a year, we have Charger Health. And I think you need to have more things like that, where you have that encouragement for founders who may work in utility companies, who may work at other organizations to start. And so for me, I like to see those things like that because I think those are the next generation of things that are out there. But I also want to talk about, just the companies that I have not invested in yet that I think should get some investment that I think are really out there, because there's some really great companies out there, such as Renewable with Tina Pena, Optimal Solar with Dr. Reggie Parker, Kidget with Paul Francis, and so many others. And I think, it's interesting that I hear often about companies mentioning that they can't find companies that are led by Black and brown folks. And I think that's just, idiotic, because there are founders out there. And I think the thing about it too is you have to take a look. One of the questions came in about where do you found these founders? And, my thing is they're everywhere. I mean, some of those ones that I mentioned have been in accelerator programs that both Nneka and I were at, either at Elemental or Lacey or Greentown Labs or Virtual Lab and others. Some are being spun out from the university, and some are there and reaching out to you, just haven't responded yet. So definitely, I think that, it's really interesting to see. And as Nneka said, a lot of the majority of those things we're seeing on the transportation side, and as we expand the idea of what clean tech is or climate tech is, you're on the food innovation side and circular side. It's really exciting that we're in right now, because I think that the more investors that come into the space is going to give founders a great opportunity to get funded, because you have different type of competition that's happening out there. As investors, you can't just say, I want to compete on writing the check. You have to provide more to the founders. And to the founders, what I'm loving, and with a recent round, one of the founders they had to actually turn down some funds, right, who wanted to invest. And I think that's the greatest thing ever, where the tables have turned.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And just a quick shout out to one of my current favorite lesser known diverse founder, Paris Smalls out of Boston, founder of Eden Geotech, doing some really incredible work on the geotech innovation side out of MIT. So just a quick shout out to him. These are phenomenal questions. I have a few more, but I'm seeing some really great questions in the chat, and I actually want to pivot to those. There's one from Alex Harbor that is really provocative. So I hope you all have some appetite for that. She writes here, circling back to underrepresented folks in venture, I'd be curious to hear speakers' opinions on the concept of DE&I specific funds. An example is the IP's Elevate Future Fund. These are vehicles to help build diverse pipelines of founders, but do they in some way exacerbate exclusion from existing institutional funding structures? How should they be discussed and considered within our own community?
You know, I don't think that they, if I'm understanding the question correctly, what Alex is saying is the fund like Elevate that really focuses on Black and brown fund managers are making exclusion from. I don't think so. I think, you know, my thing has always been, you know, there were policies and procedures and actions that got us to this point. And we need to have policies, procedures, and actions to get us out of this point, right? And the reality of it is that, you know, we're having this scenario, and there's not a lot of investors historically that look like the four of us that are on this panel, and things are changing. And we've already talked about the need for really kind of looking at other communities, as Christian mentioned, how the communities of color and underprivileged communities are really getting the tail end of the climate impact. So I think that, you know, what's happening though is that investors or LPs, they're realizing at the end of the day, it's about return. And at the end of the day, we want to invest in the investors going to provide the best amount of return. And the return is going to also come into the standpoint of, again, can those investors have access to these founders, these deals, or these investors that the founders trust? So I think after this, you know, after we see a lot of this, you know, the hope for me is that we normalize this, where you don't have to have funds that are really focused on race or gender. But right now we're not there yet, and we need to have their reckoning and the redistribution of capital, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. It's great points. I think they should be held to the same standards by their LPs, right? I think we all want to perform at a high level and to show that we can outperform the market. And I think historically, you know, we probably have. It's just not been recognized. And so I think that's kind of the goal, is to really kind of highlight like these Black investors, these Black run funds do just as well or better than the other funds are out there, because we see opportunities that might be overlooked, right? And we want the ecosystem to be better connected to those opportunities. And so I think Elevation and a lot of these funds that are coming out there serve an important part of this ecosystem that we're building, right? Because it's just more access. They're connected to folks like us who can show them who the Black founders are and make sure that we are Black run startups are not getting underserved.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a yes and. Like, I think that I am like supportive of all the DEI specific funds, but I don't want people to be pushed into a corner. So there's been an issue where I've seen a lot of founders of color or women founders who've been pushed into kind of DEI specific funds when their product is a product for everyone. So if you're making a product for every person on the market, I think that all funds should take a look at you and not just judge you based on who your founder is. Like, if we look at a generalist tech company like Calendly, I don't think people look at Calendly and say like Calendly is a Black company. Calendly is a tool that many of us use to optimize our, you know, calendars and bookings, and people get paid off it, right? But sometimes other tech companies are seen as Black tech companies, which that's fine as well, but it also sometimes there are fund managers that are a little bit closed-minded about, you know, who funds what, and they should be thinking about funding everyone equally as long as the solution is there. So that like when we have an Elevate fund that's making an investment, and I mean, I like EIP Elevate Fund, so nothing about them specifically, but as these Black-led funds for Black founders or women founders or Indigenous founders come out, to make sure that we're starting to make sure that check sizes of significant amounts are still coming towards those Black founders and not just a relegation or some sort of affirmative action towards it. So I am really supportive of them. I'm excited that they're there because it means that there's more funding coming to people who've historically been shut out of the system and continuously shut out of the system, but they're not the answer to the broken system. The system and how we do deal flow and how people make introductions still needs to be changed. So it's not a panacea for everything.
Yeah, and I want to add though, it's interesting, you know, we use the Calendly reference, but they had a hard ass time raising money. And you know, Topi had to do a lot of stuff in between to do it. And I think for me, I agree with both Nneka and Christian is saying, but I think, you know, what's going to happen is similar to Charger Help. If these traditional funds that are not looking at DEI miss out on great opportunities, then let's just make it where they're hurting, right? And I look at it like, you know, in LA, I'm based here in LA, and there was a company here, a non-cleantech company, but a company here that went up to try to raise money from San Francisco, you know, was laughed at, and then ended up being purchased, you know, for a couple of billion. And all the funds that made the investment were very small, kind of no-name funds. And I think you're going to see a lot of that happening in the DEI space, where you might have some great companies that are led by people of color, and they may have, you know, get funding from Black-led funds that are focusing on it. And then if they make a great return like we're supposed to do, then so be it. And then I think that would change. Money talks, right? And so at the end of the day, you know, whatever's going to provide a return is going to be important. If it's valuable to invest in firms or funds or founders of color, then we're going to see a lot more of that. So we just need to make it where it's valuable.
Yeah, phenomenal. Just a quick comment on that, just to bring it back to the subject matter, at least the focus area, which is clean and climate tech, and all of my clean and climate professional experience. It's been underscored to me how monolithic the sector is. So there may be an argument to be made for doubling down on some of these conversations around DEI with respect to the sector focus, given how monolithic it is. So not a panelist, but my quick thoughts on that. I'd love to keep for the DEI conversation, just for one more question here that I think could be interesting. So less from the fund structure, the thesis side, really towards the process. How are you all seeing this conversation around DEI show up in terms of your process, either deal flow, sourcing, diligence? You know, our good friends at Clean Energy Ventures have a phenomenal piece on introducing or interleaving DEI into their term sheet, for example. Would love to hear your thoughts on if that's effective, if that's valuable, and if so, how are you all seeing DEI included in some of these more process-related elements from the investor perspective?
Yeah, well, I'll start. I think, you know, one of the things I've been seeing, like, and I was hesitant because I was trying to remember the name of it, but there are Richie Cerner and a couple other folks here in LA. They did, oh my gosh, I forgot the title of it, but it's a diversity rider that we've been seeing a lot of, whether it's that, whether it's Cap Table Coalition, many different things. I think those instruments are some of the instruments we've been seeing as investors that really kind of look at the ways that we make investments. From my standpoint, one of the things I enjoyed that we did at Lacey that I still do believe in is you know, I feel like, you know, if you find a good investment, and just because it doesn't have diversity, do you not make an investment? Is the investment worth less? And my take on it has always been that, well, why don't we as an investor really help this company or increase their culture or the diversity in it? when I talk about as an investor, there are 4 things I bring, and I call it the 4 C's, which are customers, connections, climate, culture, and capital. And so with that, one of the things we've been seeing is some of the firms and some of the funds have been having side letters where they say, look, in order for us to invest, we want to see a woman or a person of color on your C-suite, senior leadership, or your board. And I think that that's been really kind of changed this aspect of what DEI means and the whole idea. And I think for me, at the end of the day, what it's about is getting more people into the space of innovation, of energy innovation, climate innovation. And that's one of many ways to do so. So it's not just about finding and looking for Black or brown-led firms, but also ensuring that firms that you have that are great have a bit of diversity within themselves as well, that look like the markets that they're trying to go after.
Yeah, I think those are all great things that are going on. And, we've seen more side letters where, there's requirements for so many, so much diversity in terms of your investor pool. And also kind of the people, the diversity that's on your board and your C-suite. It's something internally more and more funds are starting to track in their own portfolios, which is exciting to see. And we've also internally gone through training, and how do we recognize our unconscious, subconscious bias as we are vetting these opportunities, right? And it may not even necessarily be just if you have a person of color founder, but just in general, like what is your bias? What are your heuristics? Like where to bias in those heuristics as you're making your investment judgments? I think a lot of us are kind of stuck in our ways, and sometimes as you start to peel back that onion, you realize that there's a lot of bias there that could be excluding you and could be excluding people and forcing you not to see some great opportunities.
Becca, did you want to jump in on that? Looks like we lost Taj. She may be back momentarily.
I think Taj and Christian nailed it. I think the way, without going too deeply into our process, the way we track metrics is really important to us. And we probably spend probably more time on metrics than many firms that I've seen, very much around holding ourselves accountable and holding our portfolio companies accountable. Additionally, being able to point to direct change that's happening. When we built out our portfolio, we don't have a quota system. I mean, I'm not a fan of quota systems, but very intentional about thinking about not just the founders that we're talking to, but also as we're onboarding folks, working with them specifically to diversify their boards, helping them with hiring and all the good stuff that everyone else is doing. But I think it always helps to have that secondary eye of a person of color who knows what it's, who knows, the right networks to tap into, because you talk to folks and they're always saying like, oh, we tried this and it didn't work. And when you ask them like, what did you try? It's something that doesn't work because they didn't have the right perspective on the team. So I think the networks that we all have here and these groups are also powerful, because we're also leaning I know the question was around term sheets, but like when I'm thinking about creating diversity and ensuring that the companies that I'm investing in are kind of like walking the walk as well as talking the talk, I'm leaning on a lot of consulting agencies and outsourcing groups as well. So all the work that people are doing is, even if it's not public, is being worked on the back end.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. So I do want to, just before we, perfect segue into the last question. Before we get there, I do want to just ping again, folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. I did see a few questions that we'll save towards the last 10 minutes or so. But Nneka, phenomenal segue again, and want to thank all the panelists for your contributions to this conversation. I could talk to you all day because this stuff is super important and extremely fascinating, and just good people in general, right? So closing on the conversation today, I want to sort of get to the core question of the topic. What role can the BIPOC community play in investing in clean and climate tech specifically? in no particular order, whoever feels comfortable starting.
Well,
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead, Nneka.
I was gonna say, Josh and I have had this conversation that Black people have been sustainable since forever. So all that reusing of plastic bags, repurposing, cookie tins for sewing kits, like we've been sustainable. So it's not a question of like, do we need to be sustainable? I think there's a question of like, how do we enter into places where we can sit at the table and make decisions and empower sustainable choices to be the number one choice in our communities and elevate our voices for climate change. I always say that the people who have the least, or I mean, basically innovation, an important part of innovation is lack. And if you're coming from a situation where you have less privilege or less access or less money or less resources, you're going to be really creative with the things that you do, whether that's doubling up on items, whether that's, natural conservation because of a need. So you have all these tools inside of you, but they don't have a name until we decide to put a name on them. So we're calling it conservation, we're calling it sustainability, but it's just surviving and thriving for other people. So I think all of us are environmentalists, all of us are conservationists. I think it's just being recognized as a pack that we are doing this and we've been doing this. And additionally, there are so many people who don't even know that there are roles for them to do the work that they're doing in big tech or in other entities in the climate tech world. So I'm a huge advocate. We founded Green Tech Noir, it was one to create a support systems for Black people who are working in climate tech. But it's also a big part of it for me is getting anybody who wants to work in climate tech and utilize their skills for putting forward a really amazing green future that we're currently rebuilding because this world is in chaos. Like, let's do it. And then also for people in power to recognize that we are a big group and we're not divided. We are not a monolith, but we all are thinking about clean air for our children. We are the #1 demographic that's going into emergency rooms for asthma. We're also the #1 demographic for fence line communities and frontline communities. And that, the water is not clean in Flint, Michigan. It hasn't been for like more than 5 years, which is insane, right? Like, how do we fix that? Through economic power.
Yeah, I totally, and Nick and I talk about this all the time, and shout out to Danielle who kind of started a thread, Danielle Harris at Elemental, about this idea of Blacks and immigrants and all these folks having all this sustainability in our bones from the beginning. But I think for me also too, when you have more diversity in this space, again, you're going to have more opportunities for returns and for alpha and more impact as well. As a perfect example, we're talking about race here and gender. One of the things I always talk about is when you talk about geography, you kind of mix into that as well. So a lot of times we need to get out of our coast, our coastal homes, and really kind of look in the middle of our country. Think about how can this clean revolution impact our food service industry or our farming industry. But we rarely have those conversations because a lot of people don't come from those types of towns or grew up in a small farming community like I did. And so I think that that's the benefit of diversity too, is that you're going to always have people coming in there who are saying, well, what about this? Well, think about that. And I think that provides some value for us as investors, as founders in the industry as well. And I think lastly too, again, I wasn't always into clean tech, and I'll be honest, like so many people, when I looked at clean tech, the first thing came in my mind was crunchy granola, to be very frank with you. However, what I started didn't realize was that this idea of sustainability, this idea of clean tech, this idea of climate tech impacts me on a daily basis. Like I mentioned already, from the health standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from the social justice standpoint as well. There was a phenomenal show that was on BET that talked about my hometown and dumping that was done there, the impact on the number of people in the community, myself included. So I definitely think that as we really kind of expand this, we'll see more and more of impact for communities of color, for underserved communities, for many different areas as well. Just because you're allowing more people to come in as investors and founders and practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, those are all great points. The climate is affecting every aspect of our lives now. And I think every big tech company, every consumer company, every large company is thinking about what is their climate plan going to be, right? How are they going to remain sustainable? So there's just numerous ways for everybody to get involved in your day-to-day as you're thinking of whether you're, product manager thinking about strategy or whatever the case might be. Like your market is going to be increasingly focused on climate because it's probably, if not the top issue, one of the top 2 or 3 issues that the world's facing over the next few years. And so I'd encourage everybody to lean in on it, and the more diversity we have, the more say we have, because it is our communities that are getting the most affected by it, the better. Yeah.
Phenomenal, great. So we have just a couple minutes here. I do want to hit on at least a couple of the questions that are left. And again, feel free to send questions over. If the questions don't get posed in this session today, we'll either carry them over to the next session or we'll share them with the panelists directly, and they'd be more than happy to answer them, I'm sure. I do have a question here from Nick. I'll just read it out in a similar vein to Alex's question. What are the panelists' thoughts on DEI funding allocations on the LP side, so the limited partners, i.e. lower carbon carving out allocations for HBCUs? Is lowering the barrier to entry to this specific asset class for large institutions a meaningful way of allocating resources to underserved communities versus direct investments in the companies? So maybe another provocative one to close out on.
This is not a place where I have expertise, but I am an HBCU grad. I'm very proud alum of Hampton University. And I think it has to do with access to returns that are outside of the market. I think that I had a conversation with Katie Stanton at Mox CVC maybe last year, and she said something like, the 3 ways to get wealthy in the Silicon Valley are to be a founder, an early executive, or an investor. And the returns that venture funds have historically are completely outsized from the S&P 500 or your typical, Vanguard or whatever institutional, more low risk profile portfolios that a lot of endowments tend to participate, or HBCU endowments or endowments of smaller schools tend to participate in. So I think just the access for these schools who tend to have smaller parcels of money to play with is exciting, because it means that, this rising tide will actually raise all ships in a place where they might not have even had the opportunity to participate. We're talking about schools that tend to have endowments that look like $150 million or $300 million compared to, some of the Ivy League institutions that have endowments of like $10 billion. So I think just opening access and opportunities for HBCUs to play is a great thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think again, you have to attack that. There's no just one way to do it. You have to attack from many different standpoints. And I heard about what's happened with lower carbon and the focus on HBCUs. I think again, we're seeing a lot more change in that and a lot more emphasis. And I want to shout out to one HBCU that's in my hometown Paul Quinn College of Dallas. And if you know Texas, you know football is the #1 sport in the whole state. And what that guy did is he essentially, the president, took out the football field and turned that football field into a community garden for students at that space to go in and to farm and to raise money to sell fruits and vegetables to supplement their tuition. I mention the stories because, again, I think there's innovation that's already there in the HBCUs. And again, what's lacking is not a focus on innovation, but a focus on capital. I think that's going to be needed for things to move forward.
Any last final comments, Christian?
Nothing in particular. You know, I think there is a role for high net worth individuals too, family offices. I got to see some of that side on an Emerson Collective. We were very focused on trying to increase the diversity of our portfolio. So I think all LPs are increasingly thinking about it, and I do think, you know, we did some work with HBCU, VC, but just having those organizations, more of those organizations to, you know, be that connective tissue is going to be important.
Excellent, excellent. We did have a few more questions, but we don't have any more time, unfortunately. Nneka, Taj, Christian, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. This was phenomenal. It's always great, again, to speak with you all about a space that's near and dear to my heart. Again, for attendees, encourage you to keep an eye out for the next part in this session. So we'll be doing part 2 of our conversation on BIPOC representation in clean and climate tech, with a focus on founders and on ecosystem accelerators or ecosystem members. So we have some really cool names lined up for that, some of which folks already mentioned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.